A year of life as an Eskimo among Eskimos had a profound influence upon the development of my views, because it led me away from my former interests and towards the desire to understand what determines the behavior of human beings.
In 1883, a young German scientist called Franz BOAS arrived here in the Canadian Arctic. He came here to do two things. He'd originally done part of his training in geography, and he was going to map as much of the coastline, which was pretty much uncharted in those days, as possible. He was also going to indulge his new interest, the study of culture. The year before he came up here, he'd been reading up as much as possible about the Arctic. But unlike most explorers, he'd also bothered to take some courses in the local language Inuktitut. He arrived at Kirketon Island, just over that hill, which was run by a whaler called James Much. It was a thriving station at the time, and in fact the largest Inuit settlement in the area. James Much made caribou clothing for BOAS and his servant William Wyk, and outfitted them with a team of dogs. In the course of the 12 months he was up here, BOAS traveled something like 3,000 miles on foot, by boat, and on sleds like this. The work he was to do up here was eventually to change the direction of his own life, but it was also to change the way we think about other cultures and the way we think about ourselves. Okay, hey, 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 hey. BOAS didn't set out with a specific ambition to study human culture, but he had dreamt of going to the polar regions since his boyhood in Germany. He was born in 1858 in Minden, Westphalia. His father was a prosperous businessman in the town, and at the age of 20, BOAS left home to study geography at the University of Heidelberg. It was during his year of compulsory military training in 1881 that he decided to study the relation of the Eskimo to their environment. In his own words, he was going to collect anthropological material and make a thorough study of the language, customs and habits of the Eskimo.
Anthropology was beginning to take form and develop about the time that he entered the picture. It was an exciting new field, and it offered an opportunity to get some idea of the dynamics of culture and their growth and development and their adaptation and the way they spread, and many, many aspects of this, which would be fundamental to understanding our own culture and our own way of life. And this kind of research was innovative and pioneering, so it offered a very exciting prospect to him.
Before BOAS's day, the Eskimo who lived all round the North Polar Cap had not been closely studied. He undertook a geographical expedition to map uncharted areas of the coastline of Baffin Island and to get to know the different groups of Eskimo who lived there. The only way to the Arctic in those days was by boat when the ice had melted, and BOAS readily accepted passage to Cumberland Sound on a ship called the Germania. In his months on Baffin Island, BOAS was to complete the first accurate survey of Cumberland Sound and Davis Strait, a considerable piece of Arctic exploration in itself. But today the trip is better remembered for his observations of Eskimo life. He wrote articles for a German newspaper who had partly sponsored his trip, but he also kept a diary of letters to present to his fiancée on his return.
These provide a fascinating insight into the ambitions, frustrations, hardships and loneliness of Arctic exploration before the turn of the century.
Only 2 days more, and the year begins which will take me to you. The time passes almost too quickly for the amount of work I have to do here. If I accomplish everything, I still will not have the time to finish the map and the ethnographic work. I shall, however, attain my own purposes very well. I know very accurately about the migration of the Eskimo and the routes they take, how they travel back and forth, and their relationship to neighboring tribes.
One of the things that intrigued him as a geographer was their detailed knowledge of the landscape, a fact he discovered when he started to chart the coastline.
As their knowledge of all the directions is very detailed, and they are skillful draftsmen, they can draw very good charts. If a man intends to visit a country little known to him, he has a map drawn in the snow by someone well acquainted there. And these maps are so good that every point can be recognized. The Eskimo exhibit a thorough knowledge of the geography of their country. The area they travel over is of considerable extent. They have a very clear conception of all the countries they have seen or heard of, knowing the distances by days' journeys, or as they say, by sleeps, and the directions by the cardinal points.
As a geographer, he'd been taught to believe that the life of people like the Eskimo was entirely determined by their environment. He was finding out the hard way that this couldn't be the case.
Today I went hunting, but not with exactly splendid success. The only thing I shot was pulled under the ice by the current. There I sat, like an Eskimo, behind my ice hole at the water's edge, and patiently waiting for a head to appear. You cannot imagine what an impression it makes in this cold season to sit so near the edge of the water and to hear the roaring and foaming. Thick fog from the cold water envelops me. At my feet, the water foams and hisses. Only a strong current keeps the water from freezing here. Last night, I dreamt very vividly that I was in America and with you. The dream was so vivid that I was most disappointed when I woke up in the morning to find myself in the igloo. You must not imagine that such a snow hut is a cold home. It is completely papered with skins, and 2 lamps are kept burning. These supply light and heat. We all sit on a large platform which is covered with caribou skins. But I think I still prefer a European home. Today I hunted just as an Eskimo, with a spear and all that goes with it. Oksetung was the only one who caught anything. 2 seals, which I immediately acquired. As you see, Marie, I am now a true Eskimo. I live as they do, hunt with them, and belong to the men of Anarnintung.
Boaz witnessed life among the Eskimo firsthand. It was hardly a case of the gentleman explorer. He saw how much they depended on their environment and how unyielding it could be. But he also depended on them. And as he charted the coast and filled in the physical features of their landscape, he was impressed by the way in which they had mastered life on top of the world. Whether it was traveling over ice and snow, tracking and hunting game, or fabricating their clothes and houses, or caring for their teams of dogs, Boaz had to admit, as he reflected on human life in the frozen north, that what he had learned as a geographer was incomplete. He came to realize that the Eskimo often did things in spite of the restrictions of their surroundings, and not because of them. Environment wasn't the only thing that determined culture.
I often ask myself what advantages our good society possesses over that of the savages, and find, the more I see of their customs, that we have no right to look down upon them. We have no right to blame them for their forms and superstitions, which may seem ridiculous to us. We highly educated people are much worse, relatively speaking. I believe if this trip has for me, as a thinking person, a valuable experience, it lies in the strengthening of the viewpoint of the relativity of all cultivation, and that the evil, as well as the value of a person, lies in the cultivation of the heart, which I find or do not find here just as much as amongst us, and that all service, therefore, which a man can perform for humanity must serve to promote truth.
In 1885, BOAS returned to Germany. Because academic jobs were hard to come by for people like BOAS, America seemed like a better prospect. His liberal views and Jewish origins counted against him in Germany. They would matter less in a country with so many established immigrant communities. In 1893, Chicago hosted a World Columbian Exposition. As chief assistant to the anthropology section, BOAS arranged for native peoples to show off their cultures. A group of Eskimos, for example, built an igloo and worked their dogs. But now his major interest was the cultures that lived on the northwest coast of America. His ambition to display the richness of native Indian life led on to a job as curator at the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
He came here in the late 1890s, and during that time he did a tremendous amount of work in building up the research program. It began with an idea of BOAS's to go out and work in the northwest coast and work with the Indian groups there, because they were being endangered of disappearing and their culture disintegrating. We wanted to make as complete a collection of their culture as possible and preserve as much of their material culture as he could.
Stretching from Alaska down to northern California through present-day British Columbia, the tribes of the northwest coast of America were one of the richest and most distinctive areas of cultural wealth that Europeans had encountered.
You can understand why anyone might think that environment entirely determines the way a culture develops when you come up here to the Pacific Northwest coast of America. These islands are as dramatic and as mysterious as the cultures they produced. Of course, BOAS knew that environment wasn't the only thing that shaped the way a culture developed. In 1886, he came up here to trace some of the other factors by considering the culture among the tribes of these islands. And what a fantastic group of tribes they were.
Tribes like the Tlingit, Tsimshian, Haida, Bella Coola, and the tribe that BOAS came to know best, the Kwakiutl.
For BOAS, this was an exciting area, mainly because of the way in which the tribes were related to each other.
On the other hand, there were certain strong similarities in their culture. They shared common customs, beliefs, and ideas. BOAS hoped that the pattern of the differences and the similarities between the tribes, as he moved from area to area, would reveal more about the way in which a culture was shaped.
In 1901, BOAS's experience in organizing the material objects of cultural life, both in Berlin and Chicago, landed him a job as curator at the American Museum of Natural History. Here he was radically to change the emphasis and aims of organizing museum display. For him, these items should not just be a collection of curios, but rather impart systematic information and provide healthy entertainment and instruction. He held this post simultaneously with that of Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University in New York. But he didn't only teach. He was also responsible for organizing a massive research project known as the Jessup North Pacific Expedition. This, among other things, was aimed at documenting facts about the physical characteristics, culture, and languages of all the tribes of the area, as well as collecting the elaborate objects that they made.
If you want to know more about an object, it helps not only if you know how it was made, but what it was made for. Because of his intimate and detailed knowledge of Indian life, BOAS was able to place each of these objects in its original context. He understood where it fitted into Indian life, so it wasn't just another item in a museum catalogue. This splendid carving, for example, of an eagle, is a representation of a mythical ancestor of a family that BOAS knew well living at Fort Rupert. It's a revealing mask, and it shows that from the mythical ancestor, the original and first member of the family appeared on Earth. It's a funeral mask, and 3 or 4 days after the death of a relative, it was used in the ceremony to symbolize the fact that once someone had died, they eventually returned to a land where all members of that family were once again eagles.
The ancient and elaborate cultural life of peoples like the Kwakiutl was recorded in minute detail by Franz BOAS. BOAS learnt to use film to supplement his anthropological record. The subjects he chose were not spectacular, but they were an important record of aspects of Indian life. A woman swinging her baby in a cot. George Hunt carving wood, and other crafts like spinning or weaving. He wanted to record the attitudes, postures and movements that went with various tasks and skills. His students were encouraged to see their own society in the context of a much wider range of possible social worlds. In the United States of the early 1900s, this wasn't just a subject of academic interest, for people of very different ethnic backgrounds were arriving in vast numbers. But these immigrants didn't only provide justification for cultural anthropology to be taught at university. For BOAS, they were ideal material for another of his interests, the biological aspect of human beings, what their physical characteristics were like, their shape, size, colour, growth, and so on. He was interested in the way these features changed as different populations intermarried. Among other things, he wanted to see in what way environment influenced this process, and in New York there was a laboratory for investigation on his doorstep.
This is the Great Hall on Ellis Island. Something like 16 million immigrants at the beginning of this century. It was the legal gateway to a new life in America. They came in their hundreds every day to this island and sat and waited to be processed in this hall. They had to answer in English where they came from, how old they were, whether they had any serious diseases, how much money they had, whether they had new jobs to go to, whether they were prostitutes, whether they were anarchists. In 1908, they were asked another question, depending on whether they came from Europe or not. That was whether they minded if someone took some measurements of their bodies and heads. Franz BOAS was working for the United States Immigration Commission, set up to report as to whether peoples from certain countries in Europe should be allowed into America. Were they or were they not racially inferior? It may have been a strange beginning to life in America, but BOAS's findings were an important development in the heated argument going on as to whether your racial characteristics placed limitations on your human potential.
Eugenics was very much in the air. There's a good deal of discussion about which races were superior and which were inferior, and the concern about not letting the national populations, not only in this country but in England and in Europe, deteriorate with inferior races, but to keep the standard up and to improve it. And they had ideas about certain races being superior to other races, so that kind of eugenics approach with a racist overtone was very widespread in the 1910s, 1920s. There was a eugenics society in this country that was very active and had a number of rather well-known people who were associated with it. There was an underground feeling that almost anyone who wasn't Anglo-Saxon was less than desirable. And among the non-Anglo-Saxons were, of course, the Jews. But being a Jew, naturally, he was very sensitive to any anti-Semitic overtones.
Issues of race didn't, of course, only apply to the various groups of white Europeans trying to enter the States. Since the abolition of slavery, the prospects for blacks frustrated the ideal that all men were created equal. BOAS actively campaigned on behalf of black people all over America. Contrary to prevailing notions of the day, he stated that there was no evidence that they were racially inferior. The findings that he'd reported from Ellis Island challenged the concept that certain racial characteristics were fixed or stable. His were views that white America found almost totally incomprehensible, and in some quarters they're still unaccepted today.
BOAS introduced a new way of looking at race. BOAS was the first distinguished white social scientist in the United States who minimized the importance of race as a determinant of human behavior.
BOAS took a deliberate and bold social stance and agitated for a more tolerant and informed approach to questions of racial difference. BOAS's work on the physical characteristics of humans convinced him that race itself was an awkward category. Because it was impossible to define, it was of no real scientific use.
Biological differences between races are small. There is no reason to believe that one race is in nature so much more intelligent and endowed with greater willpower, nor emotionally more stable than another.
Franz BOAS taught at Columbia University for half a century. The list of his students who went on to set up and teach the subject along his lines at other universities reads like the who's who of American anthropology. By the time of his death, he was rightly regarded by scholars from all over the world as the founding father of American anthropology.
In his long and productive career, however, Franz BOAS produced a series of new ideas that changed the way that educated Americans thought about race, language, and culture.
The value of anthropology is its power to impress us with the relative value of all forms of culture. For we are only too liable to consider our civilization the ultimate goal of human evolution, thus depriving ourselves of the benefits to be gained from the teachings of others. My whole outlook upon life is determined by one question: how can we recognize the shackles that tradition has laid upon us? For when we recognize them, we are also able to break them.